Thank you for joining us around the fire. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The train jerked to a halt in the foothills of Transylvania. Inside one of the small compartments, Stephanie Archer looked nervously out the window. "I wonder what's the matter," she asked. Her mother and brother, sitting across from her, both shrugged their shoulders. "I'm glad it's still daylight," Stephanie said, looking out at the dense, green forest around them. "Scared of vampires?" her brother asked. "Oh, sure," Stephanie answered sarcastically. "Well, then you won't mind if I read to you from Dracula, will you? I thought it was fitting, us riding through Transylvania and all." Mrs. Archer sighed. "Really, Robert?" Then, the slow grinding of the wheels against the track began again. Soon the train had picked back up to its normal speed. Stephanie settled back against the old velvet seat and relaxed. Robert pulled a battered copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula from his knapsack. Mrs. Archer went on reading her own novel. The three of them had the train compartment, which could sit 6, all to themselves. Robert began to read aloud. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been half renewed, for his white hair and mustache were changed to dark, iron gray. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on his lips were bits of fresh blood, which trickled down from the corners of his mouth and ran over the chin and neck. "Oh, stop it, Robert," Stephanie interrupted. "I'm just trying to set the mood for our journey," Robert protested. "Here we are in the heart of vampire country. We might as well enjoy it." "Robert, stop reading aloud if it bothers your sister," Mrs. Archer insisted. "We'll be meeting your father tomorrow, thank goodness. Then I'm turning both of you over to him." Robert picked Dracula up again and started to read silently. Stephanie gazed out the window. The train was climbing out of a valley into the mountains. "Listen to this!" Robert exclaimed and started to read aloud again. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech. "Mother, make him stop." I'll stop, Robert said hastily. "I didn't know you were so sensitive, Stephanie." Just then, the train came to another halt. All three of them looked out to see where they were. "Quite a few people are getting on," Robert said, craning his head out the window. "I hope no one comes in here," Stephanie said. But a minute later, they heard footsteps in the corridor, and the door to their compartment slid open. A short, well-dressed, elderly man stuck his head inside. "May I join you? I'm afraid the other compartments are full." "Of course," Mrs. Archer said. "Please come in." The elderly man sat by the door, beside Stephanie. "My name is Dr. Moorer. You are Americans, are you not?" "Yes, that's right. I'm Mrs. Rita Archer. This is my daughter Stephanie and my son Robert." The old man beamed a smile at everyone. "Very happy to meet you." The train jerked forward and then began to pull out of the station. "Where do you—" Mrs. Archer began to say to the doctor. But she stopped as the compartment door slid open again. A tall, middle-aged man walked into the compartment. He didn't say a word. Without hesitation, he walked to the window and sat down on the other side of Stephanie. Stephanie snuck a glance at the new man sitting beside her. She saw his black hair, his pale white skin, and his red lips. They were red, those lips. Ruby red. Stephanie looked over at Robert, who met her gaze and raised his eyebrows. The second stranger's presence invaded the entire compartment. No one seemed to know what to say. Stephanie moved over on the seat, closer to the old doctor. It suddenly seemed to her that the dark stranger's body was cold, unnaturally cold. She started to shiver and couldn't stop. "Robert, could you get me a sweater?" Sure, Steph." Robert stood up to get a sweater from the overhead rack. As he did, the copy of Dracula fell from his lap onto the floor, at the stranger's feet. Robert bent over to pick it up, but the stranger already held it in his bony hand. He gave it back to Robert. There was a smirk on his face, and his hard black eyes looked deep into Robert's. Robert sat down again, forgetting about the sweater. Mrs. Archer handed over her sweater to Stephanie. Then she said to the doctor, "It's always nice to have a doctor around." The old doctor smiled kindly. Everyone settled back into an awkward silence. The strange man sat perfectly still beside Stephanie. As the light began to fade in the sky, his white face took on a greater contrast to his black hair and black suit. Stephanie cast quick glances at him as she pretended to stare intently out the window. She couldn't get those words from Dracula out of her mind. This man was so strange, and they were in Transylvania. "Robert," Mrs. Archer said softly, "could you switch on the light, please? It's getting difficult to read." As Robert reached up to flick on the light switch, the doctor reached over and touched his arm. "Please, Mrs. Archer, wait a few more minutes with the light if you don't mind. As a frequent traveler through these parts, I can recommend watching the countryside now. It is twilight, near sunset. The sky will be full of beautiful colors for the next half hour. You really shouldn't miss it." "Of course, Doctor," Mrs. Archer agreed. Stephanie leaned her head against the seat back. If only she could enjoy the countryside, she thought, but with that man so close to her. The train took a sharp turn, and everyone was thrown to the right. The stranger's body pressed against Stephanie. She tried to move away, but her body was wedged between him and the doctor. The train straightened its course, but the man didn't move away from Stephanie. She turned to him. He was looking deep into her eyes. Just as she felt herself about to scream, he moved away from her. The train was puffing to a slow stop in a small village. Suddenly, unbelievably, the dark stranger got up and left the compartment, as quickly as he had entered it. They watched him as he stepped onto the station platform and walked toward a young woman who was waiting there. As the train drew away from the station, they could see the two kissing. Robert and Stephanie looked at each other and then started to laugh hysterically. Mrs. Archer smiled as she rearranged her things on the seat. The old doctor continued to smile at everyone. "You two are ridiculous," Mrs. Archer said to Stephanie and Robert. "Stop giggling." But then she laughed herself. "I think I'll go and wash up now," Mrs. Archer said. She stood up and turned around to reach for her bag on the overhead rack. After she got it down, she stopped to check her face in the mirror. In the reflection behind her own face, she saw Stephanie sitting alone on the opposite seat. Why, where did the doctor? She began to say, but when she turned around, the doctor was still in his seat. How odd, Mrs. Archer thought as the train plunged into another dark mountain tunnel. She sat back down again. The shrill train whistle pierced through the air. The rattle of the wheels on the tracks echoed throughout the tunnel. No other sound could be heard in the pitch blackness of the compartment. 3 minutes later, the train shot back out into the velvet blue twilight. "Stephanie!" Mrs. Archer shrieked. Stephanie was slumped across the seat, her head thrown back. Blood dribbled down from 2 small holes in her neck. An unnatural smile played on her lips. "Doctor," she whispered. But the doctor was gone, and a full moon shone brilliantly in the Transylvanian sky. Jonas Ellerby turned his car into the plantation driveway at twilight. The long path from the road to the house was lined with giant cedar trees. Spanish moss drooped from their branches. The grass along the driveway had long ago turned to weeds. Now, already, the color of things was fading with the light. The trees were more like silhouettes. Jonas felt the atmosphere of the place surround him. He was from the north, and this landscape was strange and new to him. The driveway took a sudden, sharp turn, and the house appeared. Jonas drew in his breath when he saw it. The house was not what he had expected. He had gotten his idea of southern plantations from Hollywood movies. Jonas stopped the car and turned off the engine. He stared at the great sweep of the house. Its long veranda stretched out underneath tall white pillars. Window after window stared at him like curious eyes. In one, Jonas thought he saw a light go out, but then he decided it must have been a reflection. Jonas looked up to the second story of the house. Something was wrong with it. The rooms sagged at a crazy angle to one side. The roof looked as though it had been blown on by too many storms, and the color of the house was not the blinding bright whiteness of the plantations in the movies. It was a dull gray, an almost rotten color. It was a dying house, and Jonas was here to bury it. Jonas represented the firm of Stanton and Stanton. The firm represented the estate of Mr. Wigover, the former owner of the house. The estate had gone into bankruptcy. Jonas had come to make plans to tear down the old house and sell off the land to a real estate dealer. Even though people had warned him that the house had a strange reputation, he had come this evening to spend the night inside of it. Jonas got out of his car and slammed the car door shut. He decided he would explore the premises in the fading twilight. He followed the stone path up to the house, and then walked up deteriorating steps onto the veranda. An old rocking chair sat there, moving slightly in the evening breeze. Jonas took the key he had been given and put it into the front door lock. To his relief, the door opened. As he stepped inside, Jonas was overwhelmed by the smell of dampness and decay. The air seemed steeped in the odor of age. He wondered how long it had been since another human had stepped foot inside of this house. He walked past the grand stairway which swept up to the second story and entered a sitting room full of dusty, moldy furniture. His footsteps echoed on the bare floors as he went room to room. The dining room, the ballroom, the study, the kitchen. Just as he was making his way back to the front door, Jonas passed a room he hadn't entered before. He opened the door and peeked inside. It was a small bedroom, sparsely decorated and neat. The sheets and pillowcases were no longer fresh, but obviously clean. And this room didn't have the damp smell to it. Jonas stood and looked around the room for a moment. Then he smiled and went to get his luggage from the car. By the time he had unpacked his things for the night and put them away, twilight had faded into night. Jonas knew the house had no electricity, but he found a partially burned candle on the nightstand by the bed. As he fumbled for his matches in the darkness, he heard a chorus of crickets begin their shrill evening song. The candle blazed a light, and that is when he first noticed the book. It was sitting on the nightstand, as if someone had laid it out just for him. The title on the faded cover was The Old Plantation. Jonas decided he might read it later, when he turned in for the night. Before that, though, Jonas thought he would go out to the veranda one last time. As he walked out into the night air, he sensed a change in the atmosphere. He no longer felt just a few miles away from civilization. He felt isolated, and there seemed to be a different sense of time around the old plantation. The trees with their drooping Spanish moss closed in around the house, and there were no other sounds than the breathing of the trees in the dark and the piercing song of the crickets. Jonas moved nervously across the veranda. If he had known it would be like this, he wouldn't have come out here. He felt something on his face, and before he could brush it away, the mosquito had drawn his blood. Jonas felt his temple swelling with the bite, and he decided to go back into the house. Back in the bedroom, Jonas climbed into bed. He was shivering now. The candle on the nightstand was still burning. As he looked over at it, his eyes fell upon the book, and he picked it up. As he settled himself into bed, Jonas opened the pages to the first chapter. He read, "This story is about a young man, a northerner, who comes to the south on business. One night, he drives his car up to an old southern plantation. He decides to spend the night in the old house, even though he is all alone there." Jonas slammed the book shut and laid it back on the nightstand. He reached over and lit his pipe. His hands were shaking now as he struck another match. Then he lay back on the bed, taking long draws on his pipe. He could not get the strange coincidence of the book out of his mind. It made him nervous, but it made him curious too. He reached over and picked up the book again. In the story, the young man has just turned in for the night, after having gone out on the veranda for a while. His face is swollen from a mosquito bite he has gotten there. He scratches the bite. Jonas caught himself scratching the bite on his own face. His hands began to tremble so badly that he couldn't hold the book still. He looked up at the ceiling of the room. There was a roach crawling high on the wall. He looked over to the window. A pale moon was shining in the sky. The chorus of crickets still came from the swamp. Jonas was sweating. He wondered what the book was going to tell next. He began to read once again. The young man in the story sees a book by his bedstand. The title of the book is The Old Plantation. He picks it up and begins to read. As he reads the first chapter, his face takes on a look of fear. Then, slowly, a look of understanding comes over his face. Jonas stopped reading again. He felt the skin crawling on the back of his neck. What was it the man in the story understood? And why didn't he understand? Jonas's mind began to throb with terrible anxiety. He went back to the book. The young man continues to read The Old Plantation. The more he reads, the more frightened he becomes. Finally, he finishes the book. Then the young man lays the book back down on the nightstand. He knows there is nothing he can do but wait. Eagerly, Jonas turned to the next page of the Old Plantation. But the next page and the next page and the next page were blank. The rest of the book was blank. Jonas put it back on the nightstand. He lay there in his bed and waited. He was shaking all over now. But what was he waiting for? Suddenly, Jonas was aware that the crickets had stopped, and there was dead silence. In the moonlight, the trees looked frozen stiff. Everything seemed to have stopped. Then, Jonas heard a car coming up the driveway toward the Old Plantation. He leaned over and blew out the candle beside his bed. He didn't know what to do but wait. So he waited, without moving, while he heard the engine stop and the car door slam. He waited as he heard a key being placed into the front door. He waited, trembling under the covers, while he listened to the footsteps going throughout the house, and then stopping in front of his bedroom. Then, as the doorknob turned and the door opened, Jonas finally understood what he was waiting for. It was himself, standing in the doorway, looking at the clean little room. On the nightstand beside the bed, he saw a partially burned candle and an old book. He smiled to himself, thinking he might read the book after a walk on the veranda.